Hi everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for inviting two bankers along to today as well. Hopefully by the end of this you'll realise that Nick and I are a little bit different maybe to some of the others you might have come across in your past as well. We actually wanted to kickstart with something. I don't know if some of you may have seen this last week at the UN General Assembly. Amanda Gorman, that incredible poet who spoke at the inauguration, Joe Biden's inauguration, actually opened the UN General Assembly last week with another one of her incredible poems, which was a call to arms and a call to action, and it is utterly beautiful. It's incredibly splendid. So we thought we'd actually kickstart with some words from somebody who's far more eloquent than Nick and I could probably ever claim to be. So if you wouldn't mind playing, please.
And Secretary General, distinguished guests, and all of humankind. How can I ask you to do good when we've barely withstood our greatest threats yet? The depths of death, despair, and disparity, atrocities across cities, towns, and countries, lives lost, climactic costs, exhausted, angered. We are endangered, not because of our numbers, but because of our numbness. We're strangers to one another's perils and pain, unaware that the welfare of the public and the planet share a name. Equality doesn't mean being the exact same, but enacting a vast aim, the good of the world to its highest capability. The wise believe that our people without power leaves our planet without possibility. Therefore, though poverty is a poor existence, complicity is a poorer excuse. We must go the distance, though this battle is hard and huge, though this fight we did not choose for. Preserving the earth isn't a battle too big to win, but a blessing too large to lose. This is the most pressing truth, that our people have only one planet to call home, and our planet has only one people to call its own. We can either divide and be conquered by the few, or we can decide to conquer the future and say that today a new dawn rewrote. Say that as long as we have humanity, we will forever have hope. Together, we won't just be the generation that tries, but the generation that triumphs. Let us see a legacy where tomorrow is not driven by the human condition, but by our human conviction. And while hope alone can't save us now, with it, we can brave the now, because our hardest change hinges on our darkest challenges. Thus, may our crisis be our cry, our crossroad, the oldest ode we owe each other. We chime it for the climate, for our communities. We shall respect and protect every part of this planet. Hand it to every heart on this earth until no one's worth is rendered by the race, gender, class, or identity they were born. This morn, let it be sworn that we are one human kin, grounded not just by the griefs we bear, but by the good we begin. To anyone out there, I only ask that you care before it's too late, that you live aware and awake, that you lead with love in hours of hate. I challenge you to heed this call. I dare you to shape our fate. Above all, I dare you to do good so that the world might be great.
Just before it starts playing the next video, I saw that last week, and I remember watching her at the inauguration and thinking, what an extraordinary young woman to be able to create such poetry in the words and such meaning. And then when she stood up last week and did that at the UN General Assembly in front of all of those individuals, it was an extraordinary moment just to witness. Nick and I are actually going to introduce ourselves a little bit more in the context of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to try and make this a little bit interactive because nobody really wants to sit and listen, 30 minutes to two bankers. So we're going to try and make it a little bit interactive. But Dan stole some of what I was doing, I was going to do earlier. So great minds obviously think alike in posing the question, how are you feeling? And how are you really feeling when you unpack yourselves? Do you find yourselves almost in this kind of constant swing state between outrage and optimism? I'm outraged at the moment, especially after last week. I'm really outraged. Flight and fight, hope and despair, this binary state that we've almost given ourselves has a name. It's solastalgia. Some of you may have heard this, some of you may not have heard this. It's what some of the world's leading climate psychologists are referring to as this environmental and socially induced polarity that we find ourselves in when we're constantly moving from one minute feeling as if everything is okay, and the next minute feeling that it's not. And it comes from two words, solace and nostalgia. Solace is that deep sense of peace that we have when we know that everything is okay. Our home is okay, we belong. Everything feels peaceful. And nostalgia, that sense of grief for what's been and what has gone and what has passed and what can never be as well. And it was coined by an Australian climate psychologist called, actually he was a psychologist, he's now a climate psychologist, called Glenn Albrecht. We often hear it referred to as eco-anxiety. He referred to it as solastalgia way back in 2007. So this has been around for some time. Quick question for you out there. Who feels wealthy? Who feels they have wealth? Okay.
If it's natural wealth.
Don't get ahead of yourself, man. So that's really interesting. So we both work in finance. We both work in a part of finance called wealth management. How many of you know the origin of the word wealth? One in the back.
Anglo-Saxon, Weller, means well-being.
Yeah, Weller and wheel.
Yeah.
Yeah, two words. Old English, 13th century, Weller and wheel.
Money people.
Yeah, exactly. So one was the state of richness, and that's very much what we now associate with wealth, the state of richness. And the other word was for the state of well-being. And somewhere along the way, we've stripped out all of that well-being. We all have wealth. We have various forms of wealth, and we're going to come on to that, in a little bit. But I just want to actually ask Nick, just before we dive in, how do you feel, Nick, especially after the last week?
Well, I feel great to be here today and surrounded by so many sort of inspiring people. But then when I sort of think a little bit more deeply, I feel that we're living in an increasingly sort of mad world, and my thoughts are sort of being dragged left, right and centre. I hadn't come across nostalgia before, and I think that's a tough time for sort of communities generally. Personally, I've been trying to sort of set up a business recently as well, so I guess that's a sort of a natural time to be feeling sort of great one day and sort of terrible the next. So that might explain a lot of the last sort of 6 months in terms of my emotions. But no, I think it's a really tricky time, and I think emotions are swinging sort of from both ends sort of regularly, week in, week out, day in, day out in terms of the news cycle.
And this is why this sense of community that we've all been speaking about this morning actually is really, really important. And I was talking to Nick about this earlier. I was asked to address some people up in all places, Edinburgh Castle, a couple of weeks ago. And it was originally designed to be sort of a conversation about the role of finance. And it ended up being a conversation about the role of community and looking at radical empathy as well, something that we don't often talk about. We talk about radical collaboration, but we don't talk about radical empathy. And community is a space where we can regenerate, we can come together, and it's fantastic to be here. where we can learn from each other. We can really grow as a community, and we can learn how to thrive together. But we have to open those communities up to the very people who don't believe in our communities. And that's radical empathy. We have got to invite the people in who would choose to throw our bread. We have to invite them in to break that bread with us, and we have to teach them how to do that. You know, we have a huge journey ahead of us, so we have to be able to radically empathise. And contrary to popular belief, capitalism actually isn't broken. It's not. It was built this way. So it's not broken, it is serving the very purpose it was built for. Now, we might not like that purpose. We might challenge that purpose, but it's doing what it was meant to do. It was designed this way. And if it was designed this way, it can be redesigned. And this is where the role of responsible investing, sustainable investing, impact investing, ESG, you name it, there's lots of language out there at the moment. But this is where the role of those of us in that specific part of finance come in, is in overriding the operating code and saying, okay, well then how do we actually get back to the meaning of wealth and bring that well-being back in? And the way that we do that is by bringing emotion and values back into finance. Finance at the moment is devoid of any form of emotion and any form of personal values. We are all encouraged, whether we work in the system or whether we engage with the system, which every single person here does, we're encouraged to not emotionally engage with our money. We're told to open a bank account, create a pension. If you're lucky, maybe have some savings, have an ISA. We're not actually told to worry about what that money is then doing and where it's exposed and who you're banking with and who's providing your credit card. We're not encouraged to do that, and you have to ask yourself the question, why? Because bringing emotion and values back into finance completely overrides the whole operating code. And there are an awful lot of vested interests in finance who don't want that to happen, because guess what? That's hard work. That means you have to understand the people you are working with and the wealth holders. You've got to understand what it is ultimately they are trying to create with their wealth. Most wealth holders want to do good and do well. This is not, an exclusive choice. But because the system had coded out all of that emotion and all of that value, trying to bring it back in means you do hit resistance. And there are lots of tools out there and lots of opportunities for you all here, whether through your business or personally, to actually re-engage your values into your wealth as well, and to bring that well-being back, because we need every single one of you out there to be asking these questions and to be bringing your emotion and your value back into your money. We cannot do this alone. Now, you might sit here thinking, okay, well, that's great. How do we do this? We'll come on to that in a little bit. Overriding an entire system is a big thing. Rewriting the code is a big, big task. And Nick's business and the business that I set up as well, this is what we're trying to do. And again, contrary to popular belief, most bankers out in the system actually want to do this. And they'll claim that the system is holding them back. Well, the system is just the sum total of the parts. And guess what? The parts are all human, and the parts, therefore, all have values and all have emotions. So actually encouraging people in finance to express themselves, to lean into their hope and their despair, their outrage and their optimism, actually sets them on that journey to become a more authentic version of themselves in work. So don't worry, I'm not saying that you all need to necessarily go out and hug a banker and the world's going to be better for it, although by all means do. But actually, if we can all engage our bank managers, our pension providers, and actually talk to them as humans, not as service providers, ask them what it is that they are doing for us in the broader sense of the word, demand transparency, things start to change. I mean, they really, really do. Anyway, we want to talk a little bit about kind of just the malaise that's out there, because within all of these structural challenges that are out in finance lie the solutions that you can all access. So I'm going to hand over to Nick, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the big challenges that are out there. And then I'm also going to ask Nick just to introduce his hack, so his kind of solution fix.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the challenges, I actually think it starts very early on. This is true in the UK, but I think probably true around the whole world. And that's just from an educational perspective. I think, I don't know about you, but when you're tackling a subject matter, you often feel a little bit more confident if you know a little bit about it, or perhaps you understand some of the jargon that's used in a particular sector or industry. And certainly within finance, it's full of jargon. And and I think that was created almost in a way to sort of keep people at arm's length and perhaps in sort of worst practices hide things, hide costs and confuse generally and therefore discourage people from truly engaging with their savings and their hard-earned savings at that. And so I think from an educational perspective, I was having a chat earlier with another audience participant here, and we were just sort of saying how sort of mad sometimes the education system is. He focuses on food and sort of cooking outdoors and encouraging youngsters to sort of really engage with that process and processes around it and the sustainability. And we were sort of laughing at the fact that certainly throughout our education, I don't think I was ever taught within a sort of a school environment about food in any great detail, how to cook, really some simple things. And I relay that across to finance as well. I feel that it could be made so much more accessible if there was an element of your education that allowed you to better understand, I don't know, how the mortgage market works, for example. Now that can be very deeply complex, but equally you don't need to go down that rabbit hole to feel much more confident when you pick up the phone to perhaps a mortgage broker when you're buying your first house. So I think that we're missing a lot there. I think also that when people, if you were to ask an audience, and we might well ask you a little bit later for some of your own thoughts around some of the sort of failures of finance, a lot of people will see it and think it's pretty stuffy. And I was just watching a couple of weeks ago the old sort of version of Mary Poppins with my daughter. And there's that wonderful scene where there's, I think the father of the family goes into a sort of a board meeting at his sort of workplace, and it's full of these sort of old sort of cronies all sort of whispering around the table, and that was sort of seen as a traditional boardroom. And sadly, whilst the boardroom has improved a little bit since that time, there's still a very heavy bias in terms of sort of white males within finance and quite a lot of elitism. Another headline that I came across this week that just sort of made me shiver, because sort of I've learnt sort of my trade from sort of traditional finance and have made a leap across to trying to embrace finance with a great deal more value. But there's a hedge fund manager called Crispin Odey, and he's a fairly well-renowned hedge fund manager. You might know what's coming if you're booing, but he's also a supporter of the Conservative government in terms of donating to the Conservative government. So clearly there are doors that are open to him that aren't open to most people that are investing into financial markets. And lo and behold, he's made a huge amount of money recently for his fund by shorting the pound sterling, which basically means that as the sterling rate has fallen sort of considerably, particularly over the last couple of weeks, he's profited from that. And it's stories like that that just sort of make me think, gosh, are we actually really moving forward? Because that sort of strikes me as very old school and certainly not right. And really, I think there are so many of these areas that are entrenched in finance, and yet, as we'll come on to, I think that creates a huge opportunity, because while finance is very heavily regulated, there's a lot of red tape, there's no reason why it can't be more engaging. There's no one stopping creativity around sort of stories and messaging. And actually one of the areas, again, this was a conversation I was having at lunch, which sort of certainly resonated when you think about some crowdfunding platforms. I'm a big believer in crowdfunding platforms, not necessarily because of the joined upness of them, but because I feel that businesses are asked to sort of go a little bit beyond what they might have done traditionally in terms of trying to raise assets, raise finance, raise equity. And they therefore tell much more engaging stories. They're encouraged to sort of communicate regularly on a human level with their audience. And this is the kind of interaction that you just don't find still to this day in a much more sort of traditional investment fund or mutual fund space. And looking across industries, I'm hopeful that a lot of the younger generation who really are coming at the world from a very sort of purpose-focused background are going to increasingly think, well, look, how do we engage in a matter that might be of great passion to us? How do we relate these stories and make them resonate? And again, another example of where I think this has been done really well outside of finance, but I guess related to sort of day-to-day costs. I moved my utility provider to Octopus and their renewable energy sort of package, and I just love the sort of the freshness of how they communicate to me, and there's a sort of an email that comes in sort of every month, and you can sort of spin the wheel to try and sort of save money on your bills, and it never works for me, but I just love the sort of the gamification of it. And suddenly I'm sort of thinking like, actually, I don't mind going and taking a photo of our electricity meter this month if it allows me to have another sort of spin of that wheel. And it's simple, but I think there are lots of areas there that really a lot of businesses in the traditional finance world could learn a huge amount from.
Thanks, Nick. So, I mean, you mentioned OD. I will refrain from the obvious joke that's in that one. But you referred to OD, and obviously there's been a bit of news recently out in the markets, specifically about finance, specifically about pensions, and your platform is designed, your new business, congratulations, is designed to help people navigate what is quite a complex market. And you and I were talking earlier, obviously, with what has happened with the Bank of England, in terms of the £5 billion a day for the next 12, well now 12 days, what yesterday, 13 days that they're pumping into the UK bond market was literally to save the UK pensions industry from collapsing a la Lehman Brothers. One of the things we were talking about was how much nervousness is that going to create amongst consumers thinking about pensions, their own pensions, or thinking about setting up a pension. Because one of the things that we struggle with in this country is getting people to financially plan for later in life. It's a really big area in the UK in terms of kind of fiscal policy, helping people plan for later on in their lives, because we're all living to be older, and as a result there are a lot more complex problems that come through when we're older in terms of care. Education you've mentioned as being really, really critical. How are you taking that kind of need for education and also the need to get people to plan as well financially for when they are older? What is it that you've done? What's your hack?
Yeah, so again, I think it comes down to being able to engage with people on a very human level, and I think again, a lot of what the financial world is very guilty of is it's constantly selling a product, whether that's a regulated product, an unregulated product, a cold call, a letter that comes through the post, and it doesn't really provide any value before that point. And so I think there's a huge opportunity, and this is something that we certainly as a business will want to look into as we sort of establish ourselves, to try and find a way, again, down the sort of almost the educational sort of piece, to provide value to people ahead of them going and asking them whether or not they'd be interested in sort of working with us and sort of entrusting us with their savings. For me personally, I had lived abroad for a number of years. I'd worked in the finance world on the sort of traditional asset management side for a decade, and I'd worked to start with in the UK, and I had a couple of old workplace pensions, and I know pensions isn't a particularly sexy or engaging word, but I feel there is this huge opportunity as well, because when I looked at those pensions, and clearly I can do this with a sort of a trained eye, I was really interested to sort of understand where they were invested, and I think for the majority of us, we probably only start to worry about our pension or become a little bit more aware of it as we get closer to retirement age. And then in the case of my father, that was quite a shock to sort of see how little was in his pension and how perhaps he should have engaged with it sooner. But equally, I think it's so important in this day and age. We're all living lives where, from a very sort of tangible perspective, whether it's the food we eat, the clothes we buy, the brands we support, I think we're all doing so much better as a society in really sort of voting with our wallets for the world we want to live in, and supporting the brands, whether they be large or small, that are really doing good for this planet. And that's all great, and I'm all for that, and I've been doing a lot of that myself as we have as a family. But there's also this sort of less tangible or intangible element I would sort of view of your carbon footprint, which is every sort of service provider that you engage with, so whether that be your bank, whether that be, I don't know, an insurance provider in terms of your home insurance, whether that be your pension, these businesses are also creating a pretty significant impact on the planet, and yet you don't sort of see it and feel it. You can't really sort of show it off as you might a brand on an item of clothing, and the sort of the story that goes behind that. And what's quite scary is actually, if that's left unaddressed, it can have a really very significant impact in terms of your carbon footprint on the planet. And a lot of those businesses have become just so entrenched in their own ways that they're starting to change, but really at the margin. And I feel therefore there's an opportunity to sort of really jump into that space. I printed a report that was released yesterday, and you won't be able to sort of see the writing in the back or probably even in the front. And actually normally I print things in black and white, but because this was pink, I just thought actually I've got to print it in colour. And it's a report by a wonderful campaign in conjunction with a very traditional pension provider called Scottish Widows. And the campaign's called Make My Money Matter, and I'm sure a few of you in this audience are familiar with that campaign. And it was created by Richard Curtis, the film writer, Love Actually, Notting Hill, etc. I hadn't realised that he's also a huge philanthropist, and he had sort of been very sort of early into sort of the creation of sort of platforms like Comic Relief, for example. And anyway, they released this report yesterday, and I thought it was fascinating and really timely for this event, because they looked at the FTSE 100, which is the 100 largest listed companies in the UK. They're not necessarily all UK companies, but the 100 largest companies on the stock market in the UK. And these are all very significant, sort of sizable companies with some global footprints. And they did some work to try and figure out what the carbon footprint of those companies' pension schemes sort of summed up to. And then they looked at the businesses themselves and what the carbon footprint of the actual business was. So in sort of environmental speak, the sort of scope 1 and 2 emissions, the sort of emissions that are created by that business sort of very much within arm's length of that business. And this work resulted in the findings that actually the pension schemes of these businesses are continually creating 7 times more of a carbon emissions footprint than the actual operations of the businesses within the FTSE 100. And so to me, that's I mean, it's shocking in terms of its scale. And it just shows how big the problem is. And yet again, because, as I mentioned sort of earlier, this sort of falls very much within the sort of intangible side of what businesses do and how the, sort of the service market works around the world, it's one of the last things that people address. And so going back to me moving back to the UK and thinking about my pension, I wanted to realign my underlying pension investments into businesses that I love, that are doing good and doing well, and I think are going to be really positive for the planet in the long run. And clearly there's no utopia, but they're sort of on the right side of history. And I found that really difficult in terms of being able to sort of realign my values within the existing platforms. And so I decided, okay, well, I'm going to solve this problem by trying to build the solution myself. And Pangea, the business that I set up a few months ago, is I feel the most aligned pensions platform for personal pensions in the UK, where if you see the world somewhat similarly to how I do, you can then invest your pension, your savings, your ISA, whatever it might be, but my real focus is on pension, because I think that's hugely impactful, into positively impactful funds that are managed by businesses in the UK that are dedicated to this space. Everyone that sort of goes into that building really lives and breathes positive impact investing. And what's really encouraging, and the reason I decided to sort of set this up now, is that this is an area of the financial market that's growing quite quickly, which is great because it's certainly doing good. But it's also proven with a sort of a track record of about 20 years in terms of some of the real pioneers that you're not giving up returns in terms of the returns on the money that you're investing over the long run by doing that. And I think the first question I get, which crops up so regularly, is this all sounds wonderful, but it sort of sounds a little bit like it's philanthropic in some way. And so therefore, what am I losing by doing this? And as I say, what's so encouraging is that actually you're not losing anything, you're gaining a lot. And my personal view, I probably wouldn't sort of air this publicly on my website, is I feel that actually when you look at young businesses today, some of the fastest growing businesses have been set up over the last decade with a real focus on their purpose, and their profits are booming as a result of that. And these are businesses that I think are going to sort of slowly come into the marketplace, and these will be businesses that we can all invest into through the likes of our pension.
Thanks, Nick. So we heard from Patagonia earlier, and some of you are probably sitting here now saying, okay, great, I understand what I can do with my pensions. We've got Make My Money Matter campaign, which is fantastic. There are actually pension providers out there as well who are really starting to lean into this, actually from a risk point of view as well. But what else can you do? We're a B Corp as well. The first port of call, go on the B Corp directory. There are B Corp insurance providers, there are B Corp banks, there are B Corp mortgage providers, there are B Corp investment and asset managers, B Corp pension providers, you name it. And I'm not, obviously, it sounds probably like this is a shout out for the B Corp community. It is in part. I sit on the board of B Lab, so obviously I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't shouting that out. But it's a really good place to start. You know, if you're looking for those solutions providers who are values aligned, who represent what it is that you actually care about, and who you can have trust in, the governance of their business, which in finance is a massive issue in terms of the governance of the actual financial system itself, the values that are currently coded in. Do look at the B Corp directory, because there is a huge amount of choice on there. And get activated. You know, you often hear of finance being referred to as a club. It is a club, but you all have access to it. You've all got pass cards, you've got bank accounts, you've got credit cards. You know, hopefully you've all got pensions. You have ISAs. You have a doorway in to start the conversation with your bank manager, with your ISA provider, whoever it is that you are speaking with. You have the opportunity to have that conversation. Just remember whose money it is. It's yours at the end of the day. We spend hours talking to our clients, getting them re-engaged with their wealth, because they have been encouraged to disconnect from it and almost get to the point of believing it's not their wealth, it's their investment manager's wealth, it's their pension provider's wealth. It's not, it's yours. Talking about jargon, one of the great things about finance is there's lots of it, but one of the things you might hear about is UBOs, ultimate beneficial owners. These are the people who own the shares in the companies. That's you, because it's your money. So you have an opportunity as well to exercise your voting rights. And there are platforms out there now that can help you do this, like Tumelo, Share Action, the incredible charity in the UK that is so activist in targeting some of these big companies like Sainsbury's on the living wage. You may have seen the Sainsbury's living wage Share Action campaign earlier this year. You know, you have a right, if you are invested in the public markets, to have your voice heard at the AGM. You can go to the AGM. You can disrupt the AGM if that, something you so choose to do. But it's your wealth, so you have the power. You just have to exercise it by asking those questions of whoever it is, whether it is your bank manager or your pension provider. Or your insurance company, etc. Some of you might be pleasantly surprised to know that a lot of them are leaning into this already in terms of managing their money through the lens of risk management, because the climate crisis is quite a big risk. But a lot of them are doing it actually because they recognise that moving from what we tend to refer to as shareholder primacy, it's just the shareholders that drive obviously what it is that we do, to stakeholder alignment, actually making sure that the business decisions that we're making on a day-to-day basis reflect all of those shareholders. It's taking a little bit, we like to think of the magic of being a B corporation and fusing it into the business. And the last thing that I would say to do as well is to actually write to your politician. There are several really interesting platforms out there at the moment that are trying to get cross-party support. One is CBIL, you probably all know about CBIL. Another one is the Future Generations Act, which is actually Lord Bird, John Bird of Big Issue fame as well, which is about holding public bodies accountable for a 25-year timetable in terms of the decisions that they're making. And a big one that's out there at the moment, which has actually got a lot of support from most of the major parties, bar the current one in power, is the Better Business Act, which came from the B Corporation community, and it's about rewriting company law. Now, unsurprisingly, you probably wouldn't be surprised to know that actually the finance sector hasn't really lent into the BBA as a whole at the moment because of the ramifications for it, because it does hold all companies to a certain level of transparency and accountability with regards to their environmental, social and economic governance. But it's a critical, very small change in company law that will create a rising tide that rises all boats, including those directly in the financial services system. So write to your MPs, because if we really want to kind of try and play a role in recoding finance, we can all do this on a daily basis through exercising the voting that we have, through the money that we spend and the money that we invest, but we can also do that by encouraging our politicians to lean in some of these big structural changes that really do now need to happen as well. I'm aware of, in fact, we've probably only got a couple of minutes. Questions? Any questions about finance? Chap behind you, Matt, is actually just ahead of you.
I've had the opportunity to work with Snowball, who you'll probably know really well, and I've been involved in some investor interviews, just getting a sense of why they've invested in impact investing. I want to pick up your point about this philanthropy point, that there is this big perception that within the impact investing space that you will accept a lower return because of the impact that you're having that runs I know the big challenge of impact investing is making sure that returns are important. I guess I'm curious to hear from both of you about what's the tipping point that needs to happen that moves impacting space out of that sense of philanthropy into mainstream investment strategy, that it no longer remains a kind of satellite 1%, 2% portfolio allocation, but actually becomes 80% portfolio allocation.
It's a really good question. All investment is impact investing at the end of the day, because as soon as you invest any money in any business or any intervention, you're creating an impact, negative, positive, preferably net positive. And I think that narrative that has started to come into finance has actually really helped shift some of that perception around the fact that it's compromised returns. And as a result, it's always going to be niche. I think the quite nascent at the moment narrative around degrowth strategies, not growth strategies, as well, and focusing on actually investing in the interventions needed to create these incredibly safe spaces where everyone and everything can thrive, not necessarily grow, I think is really important. And that's really starting to come through. I'm having conversations, I'm sure Nick is as well, with some of the big asset houses who are trying to get they're noodling around degrowth and saying, what is a degrowth investing strategy and how do we do that? And I think ultimately it's actually asking you all as wealth holders one question that is never asked in finance: how much is enough? You're never asked that. I deal with, wealth holders, ultra high net worth, what we term retail investors, the mass of wealth, as well as charities and businesses. They are never asked how much is enough, and benchmarks drive the wrong performance. It's a little bit like you going on a diet and me going on a diet. And then my diet's set for me because it's right for me. It's for my body type, it's what I want to achieve, I'm happy with my diet. And you've got your diet that's right for you, it's right for your body shape, it's right for your digestive system and everything, but you lose weight faster than me. And I'm suddenly sitting there going, well shit, I'm on the wrong diet. Hang on, wait a minute, I want what you've got because you're losing more weight than me and you're losing it faster. So I'm encouraged to then, I'm using your benchmark now, I'm not using my benchmark. And benchmarks are a really thorny issue in finance because they do drive the wrong behaviour, because it means you're constantly comparing yourself to somebody else rather than what it was that you set out to achieve. And that's a big question for the FCA around what constitutes a benchmark and what constitutes, if we're going to create and maintain benchmark, what constitutes the right benchmark. Should they be financial benchmarks or should they be benchmarks based on other outcomes that happen as a result of your investing strategy, or a bit of both?
Amy, one more question.
Do I get to ask?
Yeah.
It's not fair for you to ask.
I got two. One, make my money matter. There's some pretty heroic stats around that. So if we could maybe just share just that, that's only like take a microsecond. And then when we talked in London, you talked about place-based investment, how people, I was really interested, especially with Amanda coming in and Emma on Let's Talk. Could you, in micro thing, try and explain that? It went over my head, by the way, when you talked.
Yeah, well, I'll let Nick pick up on Make My Money Matter, and then I'll do the place-based one.
Yeah, so just quickly on Make My Money Matter, the inspiration behind that was where a TED talk actually that Richard Curtis was watching, where this Australian lung doctor who was sort of coming towards the end of her career realised that she should look at her sort of financial situation going into retirement. And when she looked at the top 10 holdings in her sort of aggregated portfolio, she saw that there were one or two tobacco companies that were sort of leading the holdings within her portfolio. And she suddenly thought, my gosh, these holdings have probably done more damage than I've been able to achieve through my job, which is basically mending people's lungs and the association with smoking. And so what Make My Money Matter are looking to do is to try and really engage sort of the public at large in the UK to say, look, you should really start to think about getting in contact with your pension provider to see if equally you're investing into a number of sort of no-go areas in your day-to-day life without necessarily knowing that that's the case within your pension. And one of the big statistics that came out from their campaign really early on is that if you were changing habits in your lifestyle, let's say you were becoming vegan or you were deciding not to eat any meat, and that was clearly going to have a net beneficial impact in terms of your carbon footprint and society's carbon footprint at large. There was a calculation done between Make My Money Matter and an industry provider that was saying actually by shifting your pension into positively impactful businesses, that effect would be 21 times more powerful over the course of your life than just a couple of sort of day-to-day decisions that you were making that clearly were a big change for you, but ultimately weren't really a big change for the planet. And so they've created a lot of sort of noise around that, and they're really trying to engage the broader pension industry, the much more entrenched players, to sort of be moved into doing more in the positive impact space.
Yeah, and on place-based investing, I mean, you mentioned Snowball, and within Snowball there is some place-based investing through Resonance, for example. So you might know Resonance, some of you here, they're active down in Cornwall, focus very much on affordable housing. So you get thematic investing, which is, for example, climate change investing. So, you know, green and clean affordable energy. And then you get place-based, which is actually what are the issues that really affect this community or this place? And how is it that we then, as investors, can create pools of capital that tackle those issues specific to that community/place? And it might be through housing, it might be through education, it might be through increased access to healthcare, etc. But it's taking a very specific part of a community or part of a geographic space and saying there are profound issues at play here that need long-term patient capital to regenerate and increase the resilience of these communities so that they can thrive. What are the different forms of capital that are needed, and what are the different forms of investments and kind of interventions that need to then be supported? But it's almost kind of what it says on the tin. It's very much, you know, about place and about community. Unfortunately, at the moment, a lot of that investing tends to sit in kind of what we term the private market. So they're not kind of necessarily, the investment opportunities are not open to everybody. They tend to be for the sophisticated and professional investors because of the fact that they are private market opportunities. However, there are, as there always are, innovations happening all the time in finance where you're able to create liquid, sorry, I'm going to get really boring now, but you're able to create slightly more liquid wrappers around less liquid investments, which means you can democratise them and open them up to much broader swathes of the public as well, which is fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Great. Well, we will love you and leave you.